Sunday mornings were usually peaceful in our house, but not that day. I woke up groggy, the muffled sounds of laughter coming from the kitchen. Linda, my wife, was with her best friend Rachel and Rachel's husband, Jake. The tone of their conversation carried through the house, light and playful. It wasn't unusual for Linda to laugh, but something about it felt different. Her laugh sounded forced, almost smug. I shook off the unease and started getting ready for the day when our teenage son, Ethan, knocked on my door. He was holding a small camera in his hands, his expression tense. "Dad," he said, his voice low but urgent, "you need to see this." Curious, I took the camera from him. "What's this about?" Ethan hesitated, chewing on his lip before speaking. "I set this up near the stairs to figure out who's been sneaking snacks from the pantry. But I caught something else." His words sent a jolt of nervous energy through me, but I pressed play without a word. The footage was grainy, but the figures were unmistakable. Linda and Jake, sitting too close on the couch after I'd gone to bed. Her hand rested lightly on his knee, his arm brushing hers as they whispered to each other, their heads tilted in private conversation. Then came the kicker, Rachel's voice, sharp but amused. "You two better stop before Greg comes downstairs." The casualness of her tone hit me like a punch to the gut. I froze, replaying the scene in my mind even after the video ended. My stomach twisted. Ethan watched me carefully. "Dad, I didn't know what to do. I thought you should see it first." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "You did the right thing," I said. "Don't say anything about this to anyone else for now. I'll handle it." He nodded, looking relieved but still uneasy. As he left, I sat on the edge of the bed, gripping the camera tightly. My mind churned. Whatever was going on between Linda and Jake wasn't just friendly banter. Something was off, and now, I had no choice but to face it head-on. I went downstairs, keeping my face neutral even though my thoughts were anything but. The three of them were sitting around the kitchen table, laughing over mugs of coffee like everything was perfectly normal. Linda glanced up at me, her smile wide and easy, but there was a flicker in her eyes. Nervous, maybe guilty. "Morning, sleepyhead," she chirped. "Coffee's fresh if you want some." Jake leaned back in his chair, his arm casually slung over the backrest, a little too comfortable. "Late night, Greg?" he asked, smirking as if he were in on some private joke. "Something like that," I replied evenly, my eyes narrowing as I poured myself a mug. Rachel was the only one who seemed oblivious, scrolling through her phone. I sat at the table, forcing myself to engage in the small talk that followed, but my focus was razor-sharp. I watched their body language, the way Linda avoided my gaze just slightly too long, the way Jake's eyes lingered on her when he thought no one was looking. "Ethan showed me a video he made," I said after a while, my voice calm but deliberate. Linda froze mid-sip, her smile faltering for just a second before she recovered. "Oh," she asked lightly. "What kind of video?" "Something about catching whoever's been sneaking snacks," I said, my eyes fixed on her now. "Interesting what you can pick up when you're not looking for it." Jake chuckled awkwardly, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. "Kids and their gadgets these days," he muttered, not meeting my gaze. Linda laughed too, but it sounded forced. "You know Ethan, always up to something," she said, waving it off. The tension in the air was palpable now, though Rachel didn't seem to notice. She started talking about a new workout routine, but the words barely registered. My mind was already working, piecing together what I'd seen and what I knew. As soon as Jake and Rachel left, I planned to confront Linda. But I wasn't going to do it recklessly. No, this needed to be handled carefully. If there was more to this, if this wasn't just some harmless flirtation, I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. Linda's laugh drifted over again, but this time, it grated on me. If she thought I was clueless, she was about to find out just how wrong she was. I went downstairs, keeping my face neutral even though my thoughts were anything but. The three of them were sitting around the kitchen table, laughing over mugs of coffee like everything was perfectly normal. Linda glanced up at me, her smile wide and easy, but there was a flicker in her eyes. Nervous, maybe guilty. "Morning, sleepyhead," she chirped. "Coffee's fresh if you want some." Jake leaned back in his chair, his arm casually slung over the backrest, a little too comfortable. "Late night, Greg?" he asked, smirking as if he were in on some private joke. "Something like that," I replied evenly, my eyes narrowing as I poured myself a mug. Rachel was the only one who seemed oblivious, scrolling through her phone. I sat at the table, forcing myself to engage in the small talk that followed, but my focus was razor-sharp. I watched their body language, the way Linda avoided my gaze just slightly too long, the way Jake's eyes lingered on her when he thought no one was looking. Ethan showed me a video he made, I said after a while, my voice calm but deliberate. Linda froze mid-sip, her smile faltering for just a second before she recovered. "Oh," she asked lightly. "What kind of video?" "Something about catching whoever's been sneaking snacks," I said, my eyes fixed on her now. "Interesting what you can pick up when you're not looking for it." Jake chuckled awkwardly, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. "Kids and their gadgets these days," he muttered, not meeting my gaze. Linda laughed too, but it sounded forced. "You know Ethan, always up to something," she said, waving it off. The tension in the air was palpable now, though Rachel didn't seem to notice. She started talking about a new workout routine, but the words barely registered. My mind was already working, piecing together what I'd seen and what I knew. As soon as Jake and Rachel left, I planned to confront Linda. But I wasn't going to do it recklessly. No, this needed to be handled carefully. If there was more to this, if this wasn't just some harmless flirtation, I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. Linda's laugh drifted over again, but this time, it grated on me. If she thought I was clueless, she was about to find out just how wrong she was. Once Jake and Rachel left, the house felt unnaturally quiet. Linda moved to the living room, straightening up the coffee table with exaggerated purpose, her back to me. I followed her, gripping the camera in my hand. "Linda," I said, keeping my voice calm though my stomach churned. She looked up briefly, then went back to rearranging magazines. "What's up?" I held up the camera, watching her closely. "Ethan showed me what it recorded last night." That got her attention. She straightened, her hands frozen mid-motion. Her expression flickered, surprise, maybe guilt, but she quickly covered it with a laugh. "What are you talking about?" "Ethan's always messing with that thing." "Last night," I said slowly. "You and Jake. Sitting too close. Whispering. Touching." Rachel's little joke about me waking up. Her face stiffened, but she waved it off. "Greg, you're blowing this out of proportion. Jake's like family." Rachel was being Rachel. She always makes stupid comments like that. "You're letting her words twist everything." Her explanation was too smooth, too rehearsed. "So, you're saying what I saw was nothing?" "Exactly," she replied, folding her arms defensively. "It looked bad because of Rachel's dumb joke. That's all." I stared at her, waiting for her to crack, but she held her ground. My pulse pounded in my ears. "And the way you leaned into him? The way he touched your arm? That's nothing too?" Her jaw tightened. "Greg, I'm not going to argue about this. I can't control how you interpret things." "That's not an answer." She sighed, shaking her head. "Fine. If it bothers you so much, I'll stop hanging out with Jake unless we're all together. Happy now?" I didn't reply. She was trying to defuse the situation without admitting anything. It wasn't enough. "I think it's best if we don't have them over for a while," I said firmly. Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she nodded. "If that's what you want." I watched her as she walked into the kitchen, her movements stiff, her face unreadable. She thought she'd put the issue to bed, but my instincts told me otherwise. This wasn't over. Whatever was going on, I was going to get to the bottom of it. Linda kept her distance for the rest of the day, busily cleaning rooms that didn't need it and avoiding any real conversation with me. I played along, not pushing her further, for now. I needed to think. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I stayed up in the living room with the camera. I watched the footage again, studying every detail. The way Jake leaned toward her, how his hand lingered on her arm, the way her laugh softened when she looked at him. It wasn't blatant, but it wasn't nothing either. Rachel's comment replayed in my head, her tone playful but with an edge, like she knew more than she let on. I couldn't sleep. At 2 a.m., I slipped out of bed and went to the home office, logging into our shared bank account. If Linda was hiding something, maybe it wasn't just emotional. It felt paranoid, but I couldn't shake the thought. At first, everything looked normal. Groceries, gas, the usual bills. But then I saw something odd. Several cash withdrawals over the past few months, all for strange amounts. $180 here, $240 there, each spaced a couple of weeks apart. Not our usual spending pattern. I pulled up more records, my unease growing. The next morning, I brought it up as casually as I could over breakfast. Hey, I was going over the bank account last night. Noticed some cash withdrawals. What's that about? Linda froze mid-bite, her fork hovering in the air for a moment before she set it down. Oh, that. I've been taking out some cash here and there for emergencies. You know, just in case. I kept my tone even. That's a lot of emergencies. Why not just use the debit card if you need money? She shrugged, avoiding my eyes. I don't know, Greg. It's easier to have cash sometimes. You're not suspicious, are you? The way she asked, light but pointed, made my skin crawl. I'm just asking, I said, leaning back. We've never done that before, so it stood out. Linda laughed. A bit too hard. Well, if you think I'm hiding something, you're welcome to check my purse. There's no secret stash of cash, I promise. I nodded, dropping the subject for now. But her reaction only deepened my suspicions. Linda was covering something up, and I was determined to find out what. After breakfast, I pulled Ethan aside while Linda was in the shower. Hey, about that camera, I said quietly. Do you think you can set it up again? Maybe in the kitchen or living room. Ethan looked unsure but nodded. Yeah, I can do that. Is everything okay? I forced a smile. It will be, I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. By the time the next weekend rolled around, I was still no closer to figuring out what was really going on, but the tension in the house had grown thick. Linda was being extra careful. Too careful. Her conversations felt scripted, her behavior overly accommodating, as if she were trying to distract me. Meanwhile, Ethan had done as I asked and set up the camera again, this time tucked discreetly on a shelf in the living room. He'd even adjusted its settings so it could record longer clips before switching off. Saturday evening, Linda suggested we invite Rachel and Jake over for dinner. The suggestion hit me like a slap, considering what I'd seen. Are you sure that's a good idea? I asked, keeping my tone light. She gave me an innocent look. Why not? It's been a while since we all hung out. Besides, wouldn't it look weird if we suddenly stopped inviting them? I studied her, trying to read her intentions. Was this a test? A way to gauge how much I knew? I couldn't tell, but I agreed, if only to see what might unfold. That evening, Rachel and Jake arrived just as the roast came out of the oven. Linda greeted them with her usual warmth, and for the first hour, everything felt normal, or at least, as normal as it could under the circumstances. But I watched them closely, every glance, every casual touch. Jake was polite but distant, avoiding me more than usual. Linda, on the other hand, seemed overly attentive to him, laughing a little too hard at his jokes, refilling his drink before he even asked. At one point, while I was clearing dishes, I heard Rachel and Linda laughing in the living room. As I walked in, I caught the tail end of their conversation. You're terrible, Rachel was saying, her tone playful but sharp. You know Greg would lose his mind if he knew. Linda's face froze when she saw me. If I knew what? I asked, keeping my voice casual as I leaned against the doorway. Rachel quickly waved it off. Oh, nothing. Just girl talk. Linda forced a smile. Rachel's just being Rachel, she said lightly. I didn't press the issue, but my mind was racing. Whatever they were hiding, Rachel seemed more than willing to cover for Linda. When the evening ended, and they finally left, I sat on the couch, trying to make sense of everything. Tomorrow, I'd check the camera footage. If anything had slipped through, I'd catch it. This time, I wasn't going to let anything slide. The next morning, I woke up early and retrieved the camera from its hiding spot. Ethan had outdone himself. The angle was perfect, capturing the entire living room. I took it to the office, locked the door, and plugged it into my computer. As the footage played, my stomach churned. The first few hours showed nothing unusual, just normal dinner party chatter. But then, after I'd gone to grab more plates, Linda and Jake were left alone for a moment. They sat close on the couch, their voices low. Jake leaned in, his hand brushing hers on the armrest. You sure about this? He asked. Linda hesitated, glancing toward the kitchen door before answering. It's fine. Just keep it together. He's suspicious, but he doesn't know anything for sure. My jaw clenched. I paused the video, gripping the mouse so tightly my knuckles turned white. What exactly were they talking about? I fast-forwarded to later, after dinner. While Rachel and I were chatting in the dining room, Linda and Jake had stayed in the living room. The camera caught her leaning toward him, speaking in a hushed voice. You can't keep acting so nervous, she said sharply. Greg's not stupid. Jake ran a hand through his hair, visibly tense. This is getting too messy, Linda. Maybe we should. She cut him off. No, not yet. Just let me handle it. The footage stopped there as the camera's battery had run out. But it was enough. More than enough. I sat back in my chair, trying to process what I'd just seen. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was real. They were hiding something, and Linda was calling the shots. I closed my eyes, the weight of the betrayal hitting me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or a moment of weakness. It was calculated. For a moment, I considered confronting her right then and there, but something held me back. No, I needed more. If Linda and Jake thought they could outsmart me, they were wrong. I wasn't going to jump the gun, not until I had everything I needed. Today, I'd call my lawyer. Whatever Linda was planning, it was time to prepare for the worst. The first call I made that morning was to Claire, my lawyer and an old friend from college. She'd always been sharp and discreet, the kind of person you'd want in your corner for something like this. Claire, I need your help, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. It's about Linda. I think she's hiding something. An affair, maybe more. I need to know my options. She didn't ask for details. Not yet. Okay, Greg. Let's take this one step at a time. First, gather as much evidence as you can without tipping her off. You've already got the footage, right? Good. Keep track of anything unusual. Bank activity, conversations, anything. Her calm, professional tone steadied me. And Greg, she added, don't act on this until you're sure you have everything. If there's more going on than an affair, you need to be prepared. Thanks, Claire, I said, relieved to have someone on my side. After hanging up, I spent the rest of the morning reviewing more of our financial records. The pattern of cash withdrawals still nagged at me, so I decided to dig deeper. Using a tool Claire had once recommended, I tracked every transaction from the joint account to see if there were any connections I'd missed. That's when I found it, a recurring transfer from our account to an unfamiliar one, disguised as a business expense. It wasn't huge, but it added up over the past few months. I called the bank and requested details about the receiving account. The representative was helpful but explained they'd need Linda's consent to release specific information since the account was in both our names. I thanked them, though frustration bubbled inside me. It was clear Linda was hiding more than an affair. This wasn't just emotional. It was financial. By afternoon, I decided to bait the trap. I logged into the shared calendar we used for appointments and added a fake meeting scheduled for next week, a business trip that would supposedly take me out of town for 3 days. Linda noticed it that evening as she scrolled through her phone. A trip, she asked casually. Yeah, I replied, keeping my tone light. Last-minute thing for work. Shouldn't be too long. Her reaction was subtle but telling. A flicker of something crossed her face. Relief, maybe? Then she smiled. Okay. Let me know if you need anything packed. I nodded, watching her closely. She thought I was leaving, but I had no intention of going anywhere. If she and Jake were planning something, they'd make their move while I was gone. For now, I'd wait. Every step they took brought me closer to the truth. The week crawled by, each day filled with small but deliberate acts of observation. Linda seemed lighter, almost cheerful, as the trip approached. She was cautious, though, making sure to keep everything in line. If she was planning something, she was trying hard not to let it show. Meanwhile, I prepared in silence. Ethan helped me set up additional cameras around the house. One in the living room, one in the kitchen, and another in the garage. They were small and discreet, tucked into spots Linda wouldn't think to check. On the morning of the supposed trip, I packed a bag, tossed it into the trunk, and made a show of kissing Linda goodbye at the door. See you in a few days, I said, smiling as naturally as I could manage. "Safe travels," she replied, her smile a little too bright. I drove around the block and parked at a nearby diner, where I'd arranged to stay for the next few days. From there, I could monitor the house through the camera feeds. Ethan, who was in on the plan, would keep me updated if anything unusual happened while he was home. For most of the day, nothing happened. Linda went about her usual routine, running errands and preparing dinner. But that evening, things took a turn. Jake arrived just after 7 p.m. I watched on the camera as Linda opened the door for him, her smile warm and welcoming. She ushered him inside, and they settled on the couch, their voices low but their body language unmistakable. They sat close, leaning into each other in a way that made my stomach churn. At first, their conversation was casual, nothing incriminating. But then Jake pulled out a folder and handed it to Linda. She opened it, flipping through the pages with a frown. "This has to work," she said, her tone sharp. "I've put too much into this to let it fall apart now." Jake nodded. "It'll work. We just need to move the money before Greg gets back. If he finds out..." Linda cut him off, her voice cold. "He won't. I've kept everything under control so far." I clenched my fists, fury coursing through me. This wasn't just an affair. They were planning something bigger, something calculated. I kept watching as they continued their discussion, mentioning accounts and transfers in vague terms. They didn't get into specifics, but it was enough to confirm my worst suspicions. This was no longer about betrayal. It was theft, plain and simple. They were trying to take everything I'd worked for, everything meant for my family. For now, I stayed quiet, letting the cameras capture every word. With Claire's help, I'd take this to the authorities. Linda and Jake thought they were in control, but they were about to learn just how wrong they were. That night, I barely slept. Watching Linda and Jake scheme in my own living room was like pouring gasoline on a fire. Every word they exchanged, every smug glance, chipped away at any remnants of the life I thought I had. The next morning, I called Claire. "It's worse than I thought," I said, my voice low. "This isn't just an affair. They're trying to siphon money out of our accounts. They've been planning this for months." Claire didn't hesitate. "Greg, this changes everything. I need you to send me the footage immediately. We'll compile it as evidence and get the ball rolling. The sooner we act, the better." I uploaded the recordings and sent them to her, detailing everything I'd found. The strange withdrawals, the suspicious account transfers, and the conversations I'd overheard. Claire assured me she'd handle the legal side, but she warned me to stay calm. "The more methodical we are, the stronger your case will be." By the second day of my trip, things escalated. Jake returned to the house in the afternoon, and this time, he brought a laptop. They sat up at the kitchen table, their heads bent close together as they worked. "We'll use this to make the transfers," Jake said, his voice barely audible through the camera feed. "Everything's in place?" Linda asked, her tone clipped. Jake nodded. "It's clean. By the time Greg realizes, it'll be too late." I stared at the screen, my fury bubbling over. They were bold, too bold. The laptop, the timing, even their casual confidence, it all showed how little they thought of me. I texted Ethan, asking if he'd noticed anything unusual. His reply came quickly. "Mom's been busy. Told me to stay in my room. Didn't say why." I gritted my teeth. Linda didn't even care about hiding this from our son anymore. When evening came, Jake left, leaving Linda alone in the house. I watched her pour herself a glass of wine and settle on the couch, looking far too relaxed. She scrolled through her phone, completely unaware of the storm brewing just out of sight. I called Claire again. "They're making their move. What's our next step?" She was ready. "We file a report with law enforcement. The evidence you've gathered is solid. I'll handle the paperwork. You focus on keeping an eye on them and documenting everything." For now, I had to play the waiting game. The trap was set, and it was only a matter of time before they walked right into it. Linda and Jake thought they were untouchable. They'd underestimated me, and soon, they'd find out just how big of a mistake that was. By the third day of my trip, I was running on caffeine and adrenaline. Every hour felt like a countdown to the inevitable. Linda and Jake were too comfortable, too sure of themselves, which only made their misstep more certain. Around mid-morning, Ethan texted me again. "Jake's back. They're in the office now. Mom said to leave them alone, but they're arguing. I immediately pulled up the camera feed. Sure enough, they were in the office, their voices low but heated. Linda was pacing, while Jake sat stiffly in my chair, tapping at his laptop. "This isn't going to work," Jake said, his voice sharp. "Greg's going to notice sooner or later. He's not stupid." Linda stopped pacing and turned to him, her eyes blazing. "He's gone half the time, Jake. He won't notice until it's too late. You're just panicking because you don't know how to handle pressure." Jake slammed his palm on the desk. "Pressure? You're the one who dragged me into this, Linda. You said it'd be easy, that Greg would never suspect a thing. And he hasn't," she snapped back, her voice dripping with condescension. "We just need to finish the transfers and keep our stories straight. Stop acting like a scared little boy." My chest tightened as I listened. Their cracks were starting to show, their confidence faltering. It was clear they'd underestimated how quickly I'd catch on, and how far I was willing to go to stop them. That afternoon, Claire called with an update. "I've filed the report with law enforcement," she said. "We're moving fast because of the financial element. With the footage and the account data you provided, we have a strong case. Now, it's about timing. I've arranged for the police to make arrests tomorrow morning." "Both of them?" I asked, already picturing Jake's smug face being forced into handcuffs. "Both," she confirmed. "Jake at his workplace and Linda at home. But Greg, you need to be ready. This is going to be messy." I thanked her and hung up, staring at the camera feed again. Linda was back on the couch, sipping another glass of wine as if she didn't have a care in the world. Tomorrow that would change. That evening, I texted Ethan, letting him know I'd be back early the next morning. He replied with a simple, "Got it, Dad." He didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer explanations. As night fell, I watched Linda move around the house, her usual routine now tinged with a sickening sense of betrayal. She thought she'd won, thought she was untouchable. But tomorrow, everything would come crashing down. The morning of the arrests came faster than I expected. I parked a few houses away, watching the quiet neighborhood as I waited for the signal. The police were due to arrive shortly, and my part was simple. Stay calm and let things unfold. I walked into the house like everything was normal, dropping my bag by the door. Linda was in the kitchen, stirring something on the stove. When she turned and saw me, her expression froze for a second before she forced a smile. "You're back early," she said, her voice overly casual. "Plans changed," I replied, shrugging. She turned back to the stove, her movements stiff. "Well, dinner will be ready soon." I sat at the table, watching her with a mix of anger and disgust. The woman in front of me wasn't the same person I'd married. "How was your week?" I asked. "Fine," she said quickly. "Nothing much happened." Before I could respond, there was a knock at the door. Linda froze, her hand gripping the edge of the counter. "Are you expecting someone?" I shook my head. "No idea. I'll check." When I opened the door, two uniformed officers stood there. "Mr. Stevens, we're here to speak with Linda Stevens," one of them said. I stepped aside, and Linda appeared in the hallway, her face pale. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice unsteady. "Mrs. Stevens, you're under arrest for fraud and conspiracy," the officer said, stepping forward. Her eyes widened. "What? No. This has to be a mistake," she protested, her voice cracking. The officers didn't waver, reading her rights as they cuffed her. "Greg," she shouted, her panic rising. "Tell them. This isn't real." I met her gaze coldly. "You did this to yourself, Linda." Her expression shifted from shock to rage. "You set me up," she hissed, her voice trembling. I said nothing as they led her out the door. Ethan stood at the top of the stairs, watching the scene unfold, his face pale but calm. When the door closed behind them, the house fell silent. For a moment, I stood there, letting the enormity of what had just happened sink in. One down. Jake would be next. But this wasn't the end. Not yet. The house felt eerily quiet after Linda was gone. Ethan came downstairs, his expression tense but calm. He looked at me, searching for reassurance. "Is she?" he started, but the words caught in his throat. "She's gone for now," I said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "The police needed to talk to her about..." What's been going on? It's going to be okay. He nodded slowly, his brow furrowed. I knew something was wrong. I just didn't think it'd get this bad. Neither did I admitted. But we're going to get through it. As he went back upstairs to give me space, I sank onto the couch, staring at the now empty house. Linda's arrest was a step forward, but it didn't feel like a victory. Not yet. My phone buzzed, snapping me out of my thoughts. It was Claire. Jake's been picked up, she said briskly. They arrested him at his office an hour ago. He didn't put up much of a fight, but they found enough on his work laptop to implicate him further. I felt a grim satisfaction at the news. And Linda? She's being processed now. From what I've heard, she's still denying everything. Typical, but it won't hold up with the evidence we have. I nodded, though she couldn't see it. What happens next? The police will be in touch with you soon. You'll likely need to provide a statement about the financial activity and what you recorded. But for now, focus on taking care of yourself and Ethan. Thanks, Claire, I said, my voice heavy with exhaustion. After hanging up, I took a deep breath, letting the weight of the situation settle. Jake and Linda thought they were untouchable, but now their plan was in pieces. Still, it didn't erase the betrayal or the damage they'd done to our family. Ethan came back downstairs, holding 2 mugs of tea. He handed one to me before sitting beside me. Is this really over? He asked quietly. Not yet, I said honestly, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. But we're getting there. Ethan gave a small nod, his face thoughtful. I'm glad you found out, Dad. I'm proud of you for standing up to them. His words hit me harder than I expected. Despite everything, we still had each other. And that, I realized, was what mattered most. The next few days were a whirlwind of conversations with lawyers, police, and financial experts. Every detail I provided about the hidden accounts and fraudulent transfers seemed to deepen the case against Linda and Jake. Claire was relentless, combing through every scrap of evidence to ensure there were no loose ends. Ethan stayed by my side through it all, quieter than usual but steady. He didn't ask many questions, and I didn't push him to talk, knowing he was processing things in his own way. On the 3rd day, I received a call from the police investigator assigned to the case. Mr. Stevens, we've obtained statements from both suspects, he said. Jake's already started cooperating. He's placing most of the blame on Linda, claiming she orchestrated the embezzlement. I clenched the phone tighter. And Linda? She's maintaining her innocence, but the evidence is overwhelming. Between the bank records and your footage, it's clear she was heavily involved. It's only a matter of time before we move forward with charges. I thanked him and hung up, my chest heavy with a mix of relief and lingering anger. Hearing that Jake was turning on Linda didn't surprise me. Their alliance had been built on lies. It was only natural they'd tear each other apart to save themselves. That evening, after dinner, Ethan finally broke the silence. Do you think Mom will ever admit what she did? I set down my plate, unsure how to answer. I don't know, Ethan. She's always been good at convincing herself she's right, no matter what. But the truth doesn't go away just because someone ignores it. He nodded, fidgeting with his fork. I just don't get it. How could she do this? To us. His voice cracked slightly, and my heart ached for him. Sometimes people make choices that hurt the ones they're supposed to care about, I said carefully. It's not fair, and it's not right. But what matters now is that we stick together. We'll get through this, no matter what. Ethan looked up at me, his eyes full of doubt but also determination. I'm with you, Dad. His words steadied me in a way nothing else had. We'd lost so much, but we still had each other. That night, I sat in the quiet of the living room, staring at the family photos on the wall. Everything felt different now, fractured, but not beyond repair. Linda and Jake had underestimated me, but more importantly, they'd underestimated the strength of the bond Ethan and I shared. The legal battle wasn't over, but for the first time, I felt like we were truly on the path to healing. The days stretched into a week, and though the legal wheels turned slowly, progress was steady. I learned from Claire that Jake's cooperation had provided even more damning details about the scheme. He'd confessed to helping Linda open the secret account and funneling money into it, thinking they'd eventually split the payout and run off together. But Jake's betrayal didn't stop with me, it extended to Linda. He's throwing her under the bus at every opportunity, Claire told me during one of our calls. It's clear he's trying to save himself, but his testimony only solidifies the case against her. It didn't surprise me. Loyalty was never part of their arrangement. It was greed, plain and simple. Linda, on the other hand, had stayed silent. No apologies, no explanations, no attempts to reach out to Ethan or me. Part of me hoped for some acknowledgement, some shred of remorse, but it never came. Ethan noticed, too. She hasn't called, he said one evening, his voice quiet. No, she hasn't, I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. Do you think she's sorry? He asked, his question catching me off guard. I hesitated before answering. Maybe in her own way. But sometimes people don't know how to face what they've done, so they avoid it instead. It doesn't mean what they did is okay. He nodded, though his expression was hard to read. To keep him distracted, I suggested we start a small project together, reorganizing the garage. It wasn't exciting, but it gave us something to focus on besides the chaos Linda had left behind. As we sorted through old boxes and cleared out years of clutter, Ethan began to open up. Do you think she ever cared about us? He asked suddenly, his voice wavering. I paused, setting down a dusty stack of books. I think she did, Ethan. I think she still does, in her own way. But sometimes people let other things, greed, selfishness, whatever it is, take over. And when that happens, they make choices that hurt the people they care about. He looked down, his hands fidgeting with a wrench. I just don't get why she'd pick Jake over us. Neither did I. But I knew it wasn't about Jake. Not really. It's not about him, I said. It's about her. Jake was just part of whatever plan she thought would make her happy. Ethan nodded slowly, and we worked in silence for a while. When we finished, the garage looked better than it had in years. A small victory, but one we'd built together. That night, I realized something important. Linda had shattered the foundation of our family, but in the rubble, Ethan and I were building something stronger. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was worth holding on to. A week later, the phone rang. It was Claire. The case is moving forward, she said, her tone steady. Linda and Jake have been formally charged. Fraud, conspiracy, and attempted embezzlement. Their court dates are set for next month. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Good. Thank you, Claire. There's one more thing, she added, hesitating. Linda's attorney reached out. She's requesting a meeting with you. My stomach tightened. What does she want? She didn't say, but it's likely some kind of deal or plea. You don't have to agree to meet her, Greg. It's your call. I sat there, gripping the phone, torn between anger and a flicker of curiosity. Part of me didn't want to give her the satisfaction, but another part, the part that had spent years building a life with her, wanted answers. I'll do it, I said finally, but only in a controlled setting. Claire arranged the meeting at her office the following day. Walking into the room, I felt a mix of emotions. Anger, betrayal, even sadness. Linda sat across the table, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. Gone was the confidence, the composure. She looked at me with pleading eyes, but I didn't let it affect me. Greg, she started, her voice shaky. I know I don't deserve this, but I just need to explain. I crossed my arms. Go ahead. Explain. She faltered, her hands twisting nervously. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I never wanted to hurt you or Ethan. I just felt trapped. Like my life was slipping away, and I didn't know how to stop it. Trapped? I echoed, my voice colder than I intended. You had a family who loved you. A good life. But you chose to throw it all away. For what? Money. Jake. Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't soften. It wasn't about Jake, she said quickly. He was just there. I thought if I could get the money, start over, maybe I'd feel alive again. But it got out of control. Out of control? I repeated, leaning forward. You were ready to destroy our family, Linda. You were willing to leave Ethan and me with nothing. And for what? A fresh start with Jake? Don't insult me by pretending you didn't know exactly what you were doing. Her tears spilled over, but I didn't look away. I made a mistake, she whispered. A terrible mistake. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I needed you to know. I'm sorry. I sat back, letting her words hang in the air. You're right, I said finally. You don't deserve forgiveness. Not from me. But Ethan. He's the one you really owe an apology to. He's the one who's been asking why his mom chose someone else over him. You broke his trust, Linda. Fixing that isn't my job. She nodded, her face crumpling. Can I see him? Please? I shook my head. Not now. Maybe someday, when he's ready. But you don't get to ask for that. He'll decide when the time is right. The meeting ended with her being escorted out, leaving me with a strange sense of finality. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I was finally taking control of my life again. That evening, Ethan and I sat on the couch, watching one of his favorite movies. He leaned against me, the weight of his trust and presence grounding me in the moment. What happens now? He asked quietly. Now, I said, wrapping an arm around his shoulders, we move forward. Together. Linda's choices had nearly destroyed us, but in the end, she'd only made us stronger. Ethan and I weren't just surviving anymore. We were rebuilding. And this time, we were doing it right.